Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller. A couple of years back, in the early days of my channel, I made a video about how 1984 was the third volume of a thematic trilogy of novels by George Orwell. I've decided to go back today and look in more depth at the first volume of that trilogy, explain again how the trilogy came about, and also go into why people miss the fact that it is a trilogy. Just to get you up to speed, the first volume in the Orwell trilogy is coming up for air, which was published in June 1939, shortly before the outbreak of World War II, of course. That was followed by the incredibly famous and iconic Animal Farm, and then after the war, Orwell finished his magnum opus. What was his last book? It wasn't intended to be his last book, it just happened to be his last book because he was ill and dying, and that's 1984, of course. So if this is a trilogy, how come you haven't heard of it? Well, I'll give you some background. Orwell had a plan, long before those books were written, to write a family saga. That family saga would begin in the Edwardian period and would go right the way through the present, then, and into the future, and culminate with a book called The Last Man in Europe. That book became 1984. The Spanish Civil War, during which Orwell was shot in the throat. The war generally got in the way, other things came up, and the concept was dropped. Except, of course, it wasn't, because what he did was go forward with that idea thematically and tackle his themes of totalitarianism, political language, and the way the world was going to be when the Cold War came. Orwell was nothing if not a prophetic writer, more so than most people realise. And it's undeniable that H.G. Wells had a big influence on him. In his essay, Hitler, Wells and the World State, Orwell wrote about this wonderful man who could show you visions of beneath the sea and outer space and so on, and he clearly was a great proselytizer for Wells in his youth. However, Orwell wasn't a big fan of Wells's idea about a world government and saw that as a route to totalitarianism, and the pair famously fell out. How exactly did Wells influence Orwell? Well, that becomes clear with the reading of Coming Up for Air, so I'm going to talk to you about the book now and gradually explain how the trilogy came together or fell apart in the conventional way, but actually hangs together conceptually. So Coming Up for Air is the narrative of one George Bowling. It's a first-person narrative, and it's set in 1939, and George Bowling is 40-ish, fair-haired, ruddy-faced, fat, and he's an insurance salesman. He's part of the new lower emerging middle classes in a bureaucratic job, and bureaucracy was one of Orwell's big things. He was very interested in that, and that comes through in 1984, of course. And really, George is not a happy man. He's married to Hilda. He has 2 kids. He's sometimes an unsympathetic character in the way that he speaks to the reader about his wife and children, but he is a man who was ground down by the state of things and the way things are going and what he can see happening. And he's gone through World War I. He found it a terrible experience. He had a minor wound. He's worked in insurance for 18 years, and his existence is fairly joyless. Then one day he wins some money on the horses, and he decides that he's not going to hand it over to the missus and to buy new boots for the kids. He's going to do something and have a good time. And he is one of those people who likes a drink, likes a cigar, likes to womanize on the side. But he starts thinking, and what he really wants to do is to return to Lower Binfield in the Thames Valley, the village in which he grew up, which he hasn't seen for a long time. And he's living in a hideous new house, which is quite small, and he's finding that he's part of the rat race. So he conceives this plan to go and stay in a hotel in Lower Binfield and recover his lost youth. Something he really wants to do is go fishing, because it was the one thing he really enjoyed as a child and a teenager, and he hasn't done it for years and years and years. And he remembers a pond behind a wall where there was a huge pike, and he has this idea of going fishing and recapturing the joy of his rural youth. However, on returning to Lower Binfield, George finds it has changed and that things are different. It's an introspective novel. You're in George's head a lot and he describes what he's doing, and there's a lot of reminiscence and a certain amount of sentimentality and nostalgia for what was before. In the Edwardian period, as George was growing up, he lived with his brother and his parents behind a seed shop. His parents ran a shop which was gradually going downhill, and this is the part that's really reminiscent of Wells, particularly the Wells of Kipps and the History of Mr. Polly, because of course Wells worked as a draper's assistant and hated it, and Orwell himself at one point worked in a second-hand bookshop, one of the many jobs that Orwell did. So you can see the influence of Wells in this Edwardian period, and remember that Wells came up in the Edwardian period. The Time Machine was published in 1895, and the world was changing from the Victorian period and moving towards World War One, and that really was the beginning of modernity, of the modern world, when the old empires crumbled and were shocked by the technology which had come forward, the sort of technology which Wells had predicted just a few years before, like the land ironclads and the war in the air. These novels and stories about what would come. A Dream of Armageddon is another one. And everybody was shocked by the facility of modern weaponry as millions of men died. But what concerns George Bowling the most isn't the war that he knows is coming, and he references this many times in the text, but what is going to happen after the war, the political situation. Now, of course, Orwell coined the term Cold War, and he predicted in 1984 a standoff between superstates where mutually assured destruction stopped things from getting too bad after a limited war in the 1950s. Remember that 1984 is a science fiction novel. Just to emphasise how tied to 1984 this book is, of how Orwell was testing out the themes in this initial volume of a planned trilogy, I'm going to read you some sections from it. Now, Orwell's out of copyright, so we can do that, and it's a great thing. And there's some wonderful, wonderful prose in this book. In fact, it's my favourite Orwell novel after 1984, and it's also, I can tell you this from my job in bookselling, the least read of his novels, which I've never really understood because it's absolutely brilliant. This is my copy from 1981, which I love dearly, and I can't say enough good about it. But anyway, I'm going to give you some readings and you'll see the shadow of 1984 and of Animal Farm falling across this book. In part 3 of the book, George and Hilda attend a meeting of the Left Book Club, and interestingly enough, one of Orwell's own books, The Road to Wigan Pier, was published by the Left Book Club, which was an imprint of Victor Gollancz, who also published Coming Up for Air. The talk that George and Hilda attend is by a well-known anti-fascist, and this is what George says about the beginning of the meeting. At the beginning, I wasn't exactly listening. The lecturer was rather a mean-looking little chap, but a good speaker. White face, very mobile mouth, and the rather grating voice that they get from constant speaking. Of course, he was pitching into Hitler and the Nazis. I wasn't particularly keen to hear what he was saying. You get the same stuff in the News Chronicle every morning, but his voice came across to me as a kind of burr, 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 with now and again a phrase that stuck out and caught my attention. Now, if you think of duck speak in 1984, when Winston attends a rally and there's a speaker who is parroting, speaking pure orthodoxy, pure newspeak in the language of Airstrip 1 in 1984. And George goes on to say, you know the kind of talk. These chaps can turn it out by the hour, just like a gramophone. Turn the handle, press the button, and it starts. Democracy, fascism, democracy. But somehow it interested me to watch him, a rather mean little man with a white face and a bald head, standing on a platform shooting out slogans. So it's duck speak like in 1984. As the meeting continues, George drifts off into a kind of reverie, and he starts thinking about what is to come after the war. The war is coming soon, that's certain. Who's afraid of war? That's to say, who's afraid of the bombs and the machine guns? You are, you say. Yes, I am, and so's anybody who's ever seen them. But it isn't the war that matters, it's the after-war, the world we're going down into, the kind of hate world, slogan world, the coloured shirts, the barbed wire, the rubber truncheons. See, this is the thought police in the Ministry of Love in 1984. It's sheer plain in the text of this book, and there's lots of other examples through it. I'll read you a little bit more. The secret cells where the electric light burns night and day, and the detectives watching you while you sleep. And the processions and the posters with enormous faces and the crowds of 1 million people all cheering for the leader until they deafen themselves into thinking that they really worship him, and all the time, underneath, they hate him so that they want to puke. And isn't that Winston Smith and Big Brother there in front of you? It's all going to happen, or isn't it? Some days I know it's impossible. Other days I know it's inevitable. That night, at any rate, I knew it was going to happen. It was all in the sound of the little lecturer's voice. It's worth remembering that although 1984 is often referred to as a critique of the left of communism, it's equally a critique of the right. What it really is a critique of totalitarianism per se. And Orwell was a believer in democratic socialism, so he could see the left could be as bad as the right. So of course it's worth remembering when you read 1984 that INGSOC stands for English Socialism, which sounds very like National Socialism, and the uniforms of the party wear. I mean, the Public Order Act in Britain came up after the BUF, the British Union of Fascists, tried their thing out in the 1930s, and it was then illegal to wear uniforms and masks in public. And you know, we're seeing some things like this in Britain now, which is very interesting. So think about this in terms of INGSOC, English Socialism in 1984. Another reading. Quick, quick, the fascists are coming. Spanners ready, boys. Smash others or they'll smash you. So terrified of the future that we're jumping straight into it like a rabbit diving down a boa constrictor's throat. There are many other examples like this of foreshadowings of 1984 in Coming Up for Air. Towards the very end of the book, there's another one which is mirrored in an event which happens to Winston Smith fairly early on in 1984, when a rocket bomb descends upon London. This is a reading from Coming Up for Air again. The next moment I heard something, and at the same moment, if you'd happened to be there, you'd have seen an interesting instance of what I believe is called conditioned reflex, because what I'd heard, there wasn't any question of mistake, was the whistle of a bomb. I hadn't heard such a thing for 20 years, but I didn't need to be told what it was, and without taking any thought of thought, I did the right thing. I flung myself on my face. George has seen bomber planes flying over Lower Binfield while he's been there on practice runs, and unfortunately one has accidentally dropped a working payload. How did that happen in peacetime, you ask yourself? And then there's a revelatory section which invokes Animal Farm in the next page. It started, I said. That was a bomb. Lie down. But still the second bomb didn't fall. Another quarter of a minute or so and I raised my head again. Some of the people were still rushing about. Others were standing as if they'd been glued to the ground. From somewhere behind the houses, a huge haze of dust had risen up, and through it I saw a black jet of smoke that was streaming upwards. And then I saw an extraordinary sight. At the other end of this marketplace, and the high street rises a little, and down this little hill a herd of pigs was galloping, a sort of huge flood of pig faces. The next moment, of course, I saw what it was. It wasn't pigs at all. It was only the school children in their gas masks. I suppose they'd been bolting for a cellar where they'd been told to take cover in case of air raids. At the back of them I could make out a taller pig who was probably Miss Todgers, but I tell you for that moment they looked exactly like a herd of pigs. And of course, what happens in Animal Farm at the end? The pigs turn into people as they betray the revolution. As the rock band Suede sang, "We are the pigs, we are the swine." Interestingly, the fictitious Lower Binfield, George's home from home as a child, is referred to at the very end of Down and Out in Paris and London, which was Orwell's first book in the early 1930s, which is about his experiences as a plongeur, a dishwasher in a French restaurant, and then he comes back to the UK and he becomes a tramp, a guy on the road, somebody homeless, as we would say now. And in the closing section, he talks about how he and a friend are in Lower Binfield, and Lower Binfield isn't a real place. but it is based, as far as we can tell, if you read Coming Up for Air, on the places where Orwell grew up. At a certain stage, he lived in the Thames Valley near Henley. So if you find yourself longing for your own Lower Binfield, remember, you can't go home again. And next time you pick up Orwell, get yourself a copy of Coming Up for Air, then read it, looking out for these signs of 1984. They're blatant and in plain sight. Move on to the fabulous construction of Animal Farm, and then when you read 1984 again, you will see the strong and close connections between Coming Up for Air and Orwell's final novel. Thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this. This is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now. Please like, subscribe, comment. I have a membership area which is only $4.99 a month. There's an exclusive video every month. It's mostly science fiction. I do lots of other literature as well and various other things. And for the rest of you who already watch, please hit the notification bell. I don't normally say this, but I have noticed a lot of you have missed out on some of the recent videos. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.